Uh-huh.
Well, good morning. I'll call the class to order, those who are here, and those of you who are online. Welcome to our class today. We're on great themes of the Bible, and today we're beginning the Law, Part 1. We did the covenant with Noah, covenant with Abraham. Now it's the Mosaic covenant or the covenant with Israel, and the giving of the law, parts 1 and 2. And I did, I'm using this wired mic so we can, when we do the video, we'll see if that will work since the practice I get that work online. And as we are beginning, for both those who are here and those who are watching online, we want to mention that this group, this Thursday flock, has organized a trip. And what day is that, Robin?
The 16th on a Friday, December 16th.
16th of Friday on December. 16th of December, that's a Friday. And they'll be going to
Derby dinner.
the Derby Dinner Theater for
It's for the whole
White
day.
Christmas. It's an all-day trip. There's 21 seats open. So we need people that are, it's a bus trip going with this group, but it's not just limited to this group. Um, Anyone who can come to it if you have some friends that you want.
Reservations due by Monday, November 7th.
Reservations due by Monday, November the 7th.
Taking a charter bus.
Taking a charter bus. We have that information online for you to contact and all of that. But a great way to enjoy the season, the Christmas season, and be with brothers and sisters in Christ. So 21 seats open, so we can get those filled. As we began, I did run into Paul Nguyen the other day at Costco, and he's visiting with me, I can't remember exactly where, but she's doing a lot going on with a lot of things, and she's a little bit, so she wants to pass and then the tertiary exam for Randy Freeman, we had a successful procedure. It was 5 hours long, and that's cool. We got all the things there that we could see. So that's what we're doing right now. That's the next thing. It's going to be covered. Any other concerns as we begin? Let's open with prayer. Father, again, what a beautiful day, a beautiful time of the year. The leaves are just starting to really come into the fall and to take form and snow, and we're enjoying the beauty of this season. And again, it reminds us of the promise through Noah that you gave, that there would be a regularity to the world, that there would be discernible patterns, and that we as humans would still have the capacity to discern those patterns and to plan in accordance with them. And it gives our lives a kind of stability and variety both at the same time. Change and yet uniform change. And so we thank you for that revelation of your purpose for us and the beauty of this season in which we live. And thank you that our lives are ultimately made stable while we're building on the rock, on the knowledge that has come to us in Christ. You said if we would put those words into practice, our lives would be like those built on the rock. And we seek to come to the Word, to allow our lives to be shaped and formed by that Word, and to listen to that Word. And James says, go and be doers of them. And so as we gather today, we ask your blessing on this study, even as we thank you for Luann's continued recovery and for Randy and for the gift of this group and their trip tonight. We pray for the blessing that will come and be a part of this outing that we're planning we ask your blessing on all of this, for we pray it in Jesus' name. Okay, so we looked last week. We began to look at the beginnings of the choosing of a people, Abraham. And of course, the story of Abraham is not go over all the details of it, but the general outline is that he begets Isaac, and Isaac begets Jacob and Esau. He goes through Jacob and Esau, or through Jacob's law, and whose name actually is changed to Israel as he's wrestling with God or the angel of the Lord. And then he has 12 children. One of them, Joseph, ends up in Egypt. It's the means by which they're all saved from a great famine of 7 years. And it's there that's how they get to Egypt, and they spend 400 years there. just think about it. I mean, that's 400 years Europeans have been living on this part of the world, and so you can see the development and change over 400 years. That's what happens in the story of the Israelites. And of course, they become a great people, and that leads to the persecution by the Pharaoh arises who does not remember Joseph and what Joseph did for them, and to protect his interests, he loud enough, yeah. He begins to persecute them by putting the babies to death, the boys. Moses is saved. The whole story, we all know it, and he's given a great education for becoming a leader. Right? I mean, he spends 40 years in the house of Pharaoh, learning to be a prince of Egypt. So he had the best education in the world at that time for the job he was called to do. And it's a reminder that God does not, while he chose fishermen and he uses all people, he's not against taking natural gifts and honing them and doing that. The same thing will happen with Paul. You know, he gets the best. Microphone is not working. That's not good. Let me make sure. Now it looks like, okay. Test. Looks like it might be working now. It seems to be working. Yeah, it wasn't working there for a second. And now it's blasting out. I've got another microphone. I might just switch over to that. And so Moses then is called to lead the people through a series of circumstances. God providentially sets Moses up to be that leader. Is it working? Okay. Okay, good. It looks like it is to me. I mean, it kind of blasts out the points there. I'm going to put it down. But if that's the case, it wasn't working for a second there, and I don't know what the deal was. I'll put this down here. I think there might have been it might have pulled it where it got disconnected. And it's at Mount Sinai when he leads them. When we do confirmation, we spend a lot of time on this part of the story. It's the central part of the story. You know, when we do the Old Testament, we watch the movie Prince of Egypt, which is a really good movie. I'm always amazed most kids haven't seen it. I always say, well, everybody sees it, might see it. But it's a great way to give them the big overview if they want to know the details. And I would say the two stories you need to know. I mean, you need to know a lot more, but from the Old Testament, you definitely need to know the story of the Exodus and the formation of Israel. And then from the New Testament, of course, it's the story of Jesus. And we're doing this year the Jesus film. Have you ever seen the Jesus film? It is the most watched film in all of history. It's been used overseas and all kinds of different moments. Places of Africa. And so, so the story of Moses is the key story, and where it all culminates and where it goes to is to Mount Sinai. And it's there at Mount Sinai that God makes a covenant with Israel. He makes and this is the one where he calls on them to respond. We're going to look at that in just a moment. By saying that they're going to keep the commandments that he's giving them. Test. And as we said earlier, the covenant with Abraham was an unconditional covenant. It was one where they were told, he was simply told, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make a great nation from you and from your seed. And it's his way. This is gospel, pure gospel. There's no requirement here. It's just going to happen. In spite of Israel. In fact, if you look at the story again, what happens is there's really basically, there's one tribe saved, although there's the Benjamites and Levites still. But from the exile, the only tribe that really, the large tribe that gets saved is Judah, that's going to become Jews, and that's the one tribe that needed to be saved promise to come true. I mean, it just shows you, I mean, they want it in every way. All the 10 other tribes get lost. And the one tribe that needs to be saved to fulfill the promise that out of Judah the scepter would not depart, and that the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and that would be a descendant of David on the throne. And it's just a way of really saying it had nothing to do with these people. It's all sheer gift of God. And the covenant with Israel is the covenant that includes these stipulations that they're to obey these laws that it might go well with them in the law. So it separates it from that covenant where it just simply going to heaven. And they're told that if they don't obey this covenant, the very same thing that happened to the Canaanites that got driven out of the land is going to happen to them. There's no exception to the rule. God doesn't play favorites when it comes to the way the law works. And indeed, that's how the exile happens. They basically are like the Canaanites. They become like them. And if you know the story, they even begin to have their children pass through the fire. They do child sacrifice. They're doing the detestable things the Canaanites had been doing when they drove them out. And if you remember, even when he tells them of why they're going to have to wait in Egypt, he says the sins of the Canaanites have not reached the point of judgment yet. So it wasn't an arbitrary thing that he gives them the land. It's like it was based on the consequences for their sin. And in the same way, he's saying to them, this is the way the law is set up. So our first video today is on this idea of law in the Bible. We'll watch that now, another one from the Bible Project.
You're most likely familiar with the Ten Commandments in the Bible, stuff we generally take as good advice. Don't murder, don't steal, honor your parents. And those are just the first 10. There are actually a total of 613 commands, all given to ancient Israel, found in the first 5 books of the Bible, which in Hebrew are called the Torah. Now, the word Torah is usually translated in English as the law, because it has all of these laws in it. And as you read through them, you wonder, am I supposed to obey some of these, all of these? I mean, what's the purpose of the law? Well, that translation is kind of confusing because while the Torah has laws in it, the book itself is fundamentally a story about how God is creating new kinds of people who are fully able to love God and love others. And when Jesus taught about the Torah, he said that he was bringing that story to its fulfillment. So, walk me through the story and how it's fulfilled. So, the story begins with God creating humanity who rebels. And God chooses Abraham to bless all of the nations through his family, who end up in slavery down in Egypt, and so God rescues them. Then at Mount Sinai, God makes a covenant with Israel, like an agreement. And all of the laws that Moses gives to Israel are the terms of that agreement. They're like a constitution. And so some of the laws are about rituals and customs that set Israel apart from the nations. Other laws are about social justice or morality, and by following these, Israel would show the other nations what God is like. Okay, so the rest of the Torah is just a complete list of laws that Moses gives Israel? No, the rest of the Torah just continues the story. And the 613 commands are only a selection from that original constitution. And even these have been broken up and placed at strategic points within the story. Now pay attention, because you'll see a really clear pattern. Moses gives the first laws to Israel that don't worship other gods, don't make idols. And then right after that, there's a story of Israel breaking those very laws. And they worship the golden calf. And so Moses gives some more laws. And then you get more stories of rebellion. More laws, rebellion again, more laws, more rebellion, and you start to see the point. Right, no matter how many laws, they're just going to continue to rebel. So at the conclusion of the Torah story, Moses gives this final speech to Israel as they prepare to go into their new home. And he tells them, you guys, I know that you're not going to follow all of God's laws. You've proven to me that you're incapable. And Moses says the problem is that their hearts are hard and that they're going to need new, transformed hearts if they're ever going to truly follow God's law. And he was right. I mean, the story goes on to recount Israel's total failure. They go into the land, they break all the laws. Right. Now, the next section of books in the Jewish tradition are the 15 books of the prophets, and they reflect back on the story. For example, Ezekiel, he said that if Israel was ever going to obey the law, God's Spirit would have to transform their hard hearts into soft hearts. And Jeremiah said that's when obedience to God's command wouldn't feel like a duty, but they would be written deep in their hearts. And Isaiah, he promised a future leader, Israel's Messiah, who will lead all of the people in obedience to the law. Now, in Jewish tradition, all of these books together are called the prophets, even the historical books, because they're continuing the story told from the perspective of the prophets. Okay, so we have the law and the prophets, and they're telling one connected story about God's desire to bless the whole world through a people, Israel, who it turns out needs a new heart. Yes, and Jesus saw himself as continuing that story. So he agreed with the law and the prophets when he taught that it's out of the human heart that come the most ugly parts of human nature. It's like the default setting of our hearts is opposed to God's law. But Jesus also said that he came to solve that problem, and in his words, to fulfill the law. So what does he mean there, to fulfill the law? Well, first he said that the demand of all of the laws in the Torah could be fulfilled by what he called the Great Command, that we are to love God and to love others. So that seems pretty easy. I mean, we all want to love. Well, we think we want to love. But Jesus showed how love is far more demanding than we realize. So he quotes the law, do not murder. And he says, yes, not killing someone is a very loving thing to do. But then he also says that when you treat someone with disrespect, or when you nurse resentment against them, you're also violating God's moral ideal, because you're not treating that person with love. And so Jesus said true love ought to extend even to our own enemies. So even though this command seems very simple, Jesus showed how our hearts are not currently equipped to fulfill even this basic command of God to love others. And that's kind of a downer. But where Israel failed, Jesus brought the story to its fulfillment. As Israel's Messiah, he fully loved God and others, and he showed all of the nations what God is truly like. He did this through his acts of compassion and mercy, and ultimately by loving his enemies even unto death. And after his resurrection, he told his followers that he would send God's Spirit to transform their hearts so that they could follow him and fulfill the purpose of the law, to love God and to love their neighbor. So this fulfills the story of the law and the prophets, or in the words of the Apostle Paul, the one who loves fulfills the law. This video was made possible by... All right. Test. Right there. So there we see a little bit introduction to the law. I like how they show that in the telling of the story of the giving of the law, there's something deliberate going on in the way it's being told. It's being told such that it shows how after these parts are shown that God revealed to them that Israel didn't obey it. And so he's revealing a lot about the human condition in the way the story is being told. And so that it sets it up for them to be an answer as was prophesied by the prophets. But we want to turn to Exodus 20. Exodus 20 is the account of the giving of the law. If you look at just before that, in chapter 19, it said that the Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. This is verse 20. So Moses went up, and then he said, go down and warn the people so they do not force their way through the sea, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves. And then he says, Moses said to the Lord, the people do not come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warn us, split lines. And so Moses goes down, and then it says, and God spoke all these words. One of the things that's pointed out here is that here God speaks directly to the people. Several of the commentaries I've studied said this is the one part of the law. Later on, they're going to say, you go and then you tell us. The people are going to say that. They're going to say we can't bear hearing God speak to us. It's too overwhelming. But this tells us a lot
that they're very important. God spoke them directly to the people. The fact that God is speaking them directly to the people highlights how important they are. In our catechism, when we get to the law of God, it says, where do we find the law of God in brief form? We find the law of God briefly given in the Ten Commandments. And so it's always been the case that in Christian teaching for people that usually, in effect, at the beginning of the catechism has the essentials, things that Christians should all know. And it's always been the case that Christians have taught that people need to know the Ten Commandments because they're very important. God himself spoke those words directly to the people, and they're highlighting that they're that important. Some interesting things about the Ten Commandments. They're a part of a group of laws that are given, as they mentioned. There's the Ten Commandments, often called the Decalogue. And Deca, of course, is 10. Log is from the word logos, word. And in the original language, it was God spoke these 10 words. So Decalogue. And then, but then also given are civil and religious ordinances, and then ceremonial regulations. And back when we did a class on Exodus, way back some years back, and some people here were a part of that class, we saw how not long after the Ten Commandments are given, there's a long section where the principles of the Ten Commandments are applied to various aspects of life. And then later on, and especially in the book of Leviticus, ceremonial laws are given. And a strong part of at least Protestant teaching from the very beginning is that you can divide the laws of the Bible into these three categories, and that helps you to discern what ones are fulfilled that we don't follow today, and what ones are timeless and abiding. Let's break that down. We talked about the Ten Commandments. They represent moral law, and we see those get difficulty with the mic still not working properly from Wilma. I might just have to go back to the mic I was using, it sounds like. I'm sorry to say. There was probably a reason we didn't use these mics. The moral law, 10 Commandments, and there's others we'll talk about. The civil law, that has to do with their regulation of, putting up things like cities of refuge, how you would deal with someone who was accused of murder, things like that. And then ceremonial laws, they had to do with relationship to the tabernacle and being clean or unclean foods, things like that. And the traditional Protestant teaching was that the civil laws and the ceremonial laws no longer apply in the way of the moral laws. The ceremonial laws have been fulfilled in Christ. Paul makes that clear in Colossians when he says, let no one judge you based upon a day or meat or something like that. These are the shadow, Christ is the substance. So these things were pointing to being different, being set apart, being sanctified. And when Christ comes into your life and he begins to make you a different person, he's fulfilling the meaning of what the ceremonial laws were meant to do. They were meant to set Israel apart and make them a distinct people so that they stood out, these ceremonial laws. And to teach basic things like clean and unclean, like lepers and that. And the civil laws, of course, apply to a particular nation at a particular time. And while there may be things we can glean from them, they're not brought over into the New Testament. They're never forcing those three points on right now. But the moral laws that were reaffirmed by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, as they alluded to, when he said it's not just that you're not murder, but it's despise the other person. And then in various places also in Paul's letters, it's very obvious that he's following the Ten Commandments and building his teaching off of them. So that the moral laws continue over into our time. Another thing about these moral laws that make them different, especially the Ten Commandments, what makes them stand out, we'll read them in just a minute and go over the first four, the ones related to God, is that they're known as what is called apodictic law. And I say this again, what separates them from other people's is other people's had what you might call case laws, where a certain situation would come up, and then a judge would make a ruling on it, and then that ruling would become the way people would respond in the future. Usually this ruling has been set. It was related to a particular case. And English common law is a lot like that. What English common law, which our country has adopted, is something that it bubbles up from the people in a way, and it becomes agreed upon by everybody that this is right. And that's how so the laws of Hammurabi and other laws of the ancient people were case laws, and they were handled by the king and other people, and then they became, this is what we'll do in the future in relation to this situation. Apodictic law is putting forward a moral principle, and a thou shalt not. That thou shalt not characteristic is very different from any other people. This is unique to Israel. So it's one of those things, again, that points to this idea of divine revelation, that this isn't something that they came up with. No other culture had this kind of thing, of having a thou shalt not law. They were completely unique in that. And then the also thing that was unique for them is anchoring law in religion. Again, the laws of Hammurabi and the other laws of the Babylonians, these were laws that came up in the civil sphere. They weren't laws handed down by the gods or God. They were things that they knew that their leaders had developed. But connecting the law with God, that was unique. The Jewish commentary says it this way. This is actually from the anchoring of law in religion is unique to the legal tradition of Israel in the ancient Near East. Law and spirituality merge into one in the formation of the Hebrew Bible. The commandments are meant not only as laws of behavior, but also as objects of contemplation and lead toward the perception and love of God. That is, at Mount Sinai, God is not just giving laws like a king would give laws, he's also revealing himself. And this is unique in Israel. They believe that the moral laws are not just a group decision, that we're going to say this is how we're going to act. No, this is how God himself actually is. And this is how reality is. This law speaks to the nature of reality. Reality involves these things being objectively right. These 10 words are distinguished from the rest of the law of God as they are audibly delivered to Moses by God himself and later written down in two tablets. And all these words, in Hebrew, word is deliberately connected with the verb spoke. The whole stress is that these commandments are words of revelation from God. The emphasis is primarily on their source, and secondarily on their purpose, and only thirdly on their content. Although this is naturally governed by God's nature, it has been well said that the commandments are God's nature expressed in terms of moral imperatives. And it is significant that God chose to reveal himself so rather than in terms of philosophical propositions. But it's just another way of saying that for the Jewish people, they come to realize that the law is not some arbitrary thing. It's actually rooted in the very nature of God. He's the gold standard. And so these things reflect his character, and all of creation reflects his character. And so another place for this is made obvious is when they're told to observe the Sabbath day. They're to remember it, and that's a hearkening back to creation, because creation story mentions the Sabbath day. And that's, again, they said another way that they stand out, in that they believe that these laws were rooted in the very nature of creation itself, and that they reflect the created order. So this really stands out from the other people, where it's very much an arbitrary thing that they just develop these things. Instead, for them, these things are rooted in the very order of creation and ultimately in God's own being. But let's now look at Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 1. I'm going to do something here just because in case there is someone more. That actually is going to become the first commandment for Jews. It doesn't seem like a commandment to us, but to them that's a commandment to believe in God. And the first commandment for them, different from Protestants and Catholics and Lutherans. Catholics and Lutherans order the commandments one way, and other Protestants order it in a different way. So our church, we order it, the first 4 commandments relate to God, and Lutheran and Catholic, it's the first 3, because they combine with our first 2, and then they split up covet into 2 different parts. But it says in Exodus 20, verse 1, "And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." Now that you shall have no other gods before me, that's how we order the commandments. But again, and this was from the Torah commentary by Sarna. He mentions, and he's a Jewish writer, that for Jews, this is from Fortress Press. In Jewish tradition, the self-revelation of God is the first commandment. It is interpreted as a demand for faith in the deity. The prohibition against graven images is the second law for them. And so there's something to be said about that you begin by putting your trust in God. I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt. He's reminding them. We generally take that as the basis for the 10 Commandments. That he's reminding them the reason why they're to trust him and have faith in him is what he did for them. He brought them out of the house of bondage. And as one person pointed out, since he brought them out of slavery, it shows that he's a God who doesn't want to enslave them, and that these commandments are not a form of slavery then. I thought that was a good point, the author who said that he's a God who seeks to liberate people. And so oftentimes people think of the commandments as that which hinders their lives and leads to slavery. And the same thing will happen with Jesus. I've come to set you free. If the Son sets you free, you'll be free indeed. And it's in the becoming of a disciple and the submitting of yourself to him and the dying to your old life that paradoxically you become free in the submitting of yourself to your true nature, which is, again, the idea that we're not submitting to something arbitrary. We're submitting to the true nature of reality. And when we do that, we become free. But this next statement, you shall have no other gods before me. When the text says that there should be no other gods before me, it does not refer to others having a higher position than Yahweh. The introduction in verse 2 has already indicated as a pre-existing assumption that Yahweh is their God. The phrase before me means in my presence, and therefore prohibits other gods from being considered to be in his presence. This prohibits several concepts that were standard parts of ancient beliefs. Most religions of that day had a pantheon, a divine assembly that ruled the realm of the gods, the supernatural, and ultimately the human world. There would typically be a deity who was designated head of the pantheon, and he, like the other gods, would have at least one consort, a female partner. They're calling Camilla the queen consort, right? She's not, if he dies, she can't become queen, but she's the one who's with Charles. Well, in the same way, the gods back then had a consort, but again, they are to be different. So many things about the Ten Commandments, you can say, well, it reflects the time in which it was written, and one of them points out that the covenant being made, Wilma says we're back to normal, thanks. You're welcome, Wilma. I'm just going to stick with this mic. So many things, it's so fascinating. There have been those skeptical scholars who said, oh, this couldn't go back to the time of Moses. Well, first of all, it was just in recent years that they found a writing from about 2000 BC. And it showed that that kind of writing was then, and it's dated 2000 BC. That was just in recent years. It was a really interesting article. I can get it if someone ever wants to see it. There was an archaeologist in Texas who discovered this. So it just proved conclusively. I mean, there was a long series of times that the very kind of critical scholars said, there's no way they didn't have writing 2000 BC at the time of Moses. We found there's actual writing like that. But the actual form of the covenant that's being made follows in its parts, not the content, but in its form, the parts, the way covenants were made in that time period. So God worked through a form that they understood, but the content is what makes them different. The form is something they would recognize. Oh, this is a covenant made between a higher king to a lower king. It's called a suzerain vassal treaty. If you study like Old Testament, the suzerain was it's like in the Middle Ages when you'd have the high king and then the lower princes of various areas. There was the Holy Roman Emperor, and then you had the various princes, and especially Germany had all these different little kingdoms within it. And the form follows that, but the content, God doesn't have a consort queen. The things that this law, again, is something that's not arbitrary. All that stands out in making it different. Yes? Yes. Well, again, he said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. He was revealing him. Why didn't he say, I'm the only God? In essence, he's revealing that to them, that they're not to. As they say here, there are no gods. Yes, he does. It does imply that other people worship other gods, and they do have other things that, as like Luther says, they fear, love, and trust above all else. And so he is, in this essence, recognizing that other people have other gods, but they're not to recognize. As one person said, this commandment bans much mythology that deals with interactions of the gods with one another. You're bringing up an interesting point, because this is brought up about the Ten Commandments, is about monotheism, and that it does seem, one idea about the Old Testament and the Bible in general is that it involves a progressive revelation, and that is God works with people where they're at. He allows things in the Old Testament that we would not allow today, like slavery, for example. People often get upset that within the commandments, slavery is allowed. They don't recognize that for its time, it was the most humane expression of it. Again, the similarities are there, but the differences really stand out. When we went through all the specific laws, when we did the book of Exodus, that kept coming out every time we would study it. But there is an accommodation in those applied laws to their time. So you might say the Ten Commandments are these timeless laws, and then there's the application, which is the next set of laws, and that application oftentimes is an accommodation to the time. Well, many people believe that in the same way, God recognizes that for them to make that leap, there needs to be this ongoing relationship with him where they come to this knowledge of there's only one God. But he does say to them, and the Shema, which is in Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one." And there is that. And one of the things when you look at progressive revelation, the truth is there at the very beginning, but it's in germ form. And the longer the story goes, the more clear it becomes. And you go back and you look, and it's there all along that there's only one God. But God has to lead them to that knowledge. So here he's telling them, you're to have no other gods in my presence. There's no pantheon. He's already setting the stage for there's only one God. There's only me. But that's not to say, again, because even remember, Jesus will quote the psalm that says, "You are all gods." Remember when he quotes that about human beings. And that's from the Psalms. It's an interesting verse that he quotes. And it has to do with the fact, not that we're anything on the level of God, but that we are spiritual beings with great potentiality as human beings. You know, we can create things. We have intelligence. And I think also in the Old Testament, it's very strongly taught that there are other spiritual realities besides God. They're not God in the sense of what God is, but the Old Testament does affirm that there are many spiritual realities, and that behind some of these gods that they're worshiping are that which we would call evil spirits or the demonic involved. And so I think in leading them to that understanding, there's that teasing out the difference between God and spiritual beings. And the Bible doesn't teach a pantheon of gods with God, but especially the Old Testament does teach a divine council that's with God, these spiritual beings. And so it is a fascinating way the Old Testament works in this progressive revelation. Yeah, people will read the Old Testament, and sometimes, again, they want it to be that God is going to change people on a dime and change culture on a dime. And he doesn't work that way. And I think it's frustrating oftentimes to people. It's like the world in which we live. He allows a lot of freedom and works in through the natural processes by which people learn and grow. Mm-hmm. I'm bringing it to a culmination. Its true meaning. That was for its time, but this isn't. It's a different time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And looking back, you can see, well, the deeper message always was, love your neighbor as yourself, and all those things. It always was there when you go back. Let's go to verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So not to make any images. This is an interesting thing because the Protestants went two directions with this. One group said, we can have pictures of Jesus. We can have representations of things on earth, but we just are not to worship them. And then the other Protestant group said, no, none at all. And so one example of that is if you go out to New England, for example, and you go to the old congregational churches. You know, when the United Church of Christ was formed in 1957, it was these German background churches, ENR, merged with the English Puritan and Pilgrim churches. And there was a difference between them because if you go to any of these background churches like Salem, they'll have images in them. You go down to Zion downtown, there's a Jesus in the front he's got a halo, but I remember one time I did a wedding down there and Maxwell said, why is Jesus wearing a cowboy hat?
because it looks like it, but it's in the front of the church. And if you go to Bethel on Green River, there's an image of Jesus on the front, a resurrected Christ. For many years, the two pictures underneath the balcony at Salem were in the front of the church. It was in the 70s when they put those other things up front. So they had a picture on one side of Jesus knocking on the door of representing Revelation, and the other one, him with the lambs. You would never have that in an English Puritan church. You go in and it's just white walls in those English. And they represent what's called the Reformed background. And the Reformed believe you're not to have any images. But this shows you kind of the history of our church, which is more akin to the Lutheran that way. It says, what is meant by the second commandment? God forbids us to worship him in any image. He requires us to worship him as he has taught us in his word and revealed himself to us in his Son, Jesus Christ. That group of Protestants said, it's not the making of images that's wrong. And again, you think about a very extreme example of that. The Amish today still will not put any kind of pictures or even have pictures made of themselves, because they're taking it that you can't make any images of things on earth, make them at all. So here's what one of the commentators says. The second commandment concerns how Yahweh is to be worshipped, for the idols that it prohibits are idols of him. The commandment has nothing to do with art. Though the graven images of the ancient world were indeed works of art, they were typically carved of wood and overlaid with hammered sheets of silver and gold and clothed in the finest attire. But the prohibition is more concerned with how they are employed, and here the issue is power. Images of deity in the ancient Near East were where the deity became present in a special way. As a result of this linkage, spells, incantations, and other magical arts could be performed on the image in order to threaten, bind, or compel the deity. And an ongoing living example of that is the idea of the voodoo doll. When I was down in New Orleans, we went into this kind of traditional place, and they had a bunch of voodoo dolls for sale. And what is that? It's supposed to be that person, and you do things to it. And the idea is they didn't believe the image was that person. Even the pagans didn't believe it. But they did believe that gave them some kind of control. And again, you live in a world that is uncertain, right? And you're trying to create some kind of certainty. I mean, one of the big issues for them in the ancient world was fertility. That is, how we're going to make it through the winter if we don't have good crops. So what can we do to ensure fertility? Sometimes people wonder about these ritual prostitution that happened in the ancient world. But people recognized that the sexual act had to do with bringing forth life. And they thought if they engaged in these sexual practices, they were helping to bring forth life and to provide for themselves. I mean, they were looking for ways to get control of it. People are trying that today. I mean, we're all trying to have certainty, right? We want to we do things like now we have insurance, like farmers have crop insurance, and so it's a lot less superstitious way of doing it, but it's still a way of trying to minimize risk and to get control. And when God's saying not to have any images of him, he's saying, don't seek to control me. Again, another commentary. People in the ancient Near East believed the spiritual entity inhabited the idol, the deity resided or attached itself to the object, and the person who fashioned the idol made offerings or sacrifices to it to beckon and localize the deity and have a relationship with it. And so, again, right after this commandment not to make any images and worship them, they're commanded to put all kinds of angels inside the tabernacle. They're commanded to make a menorah of the lampstand that looks like the tree of life. And the inside of the tabernacle was filled with images of both heaven and earth. And so churches like ours have said that shows that commandment never was that you're not to make any. Why would he do that right after? It's that you're not to worship him in any image, to get control over him. Let's go to the next commandment, which is the third commandment, as we number them. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord your God will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses the name of the Lord. As the second commandment concerned the issue of exercising power over God, we just said that. The third turns its attention to exercising God's power over others. The commandment does not so much refer to blasphemy or foul language, although we can say that by extension. But in its time, it was meant to prevent the exploitation of the name of the Lord for magical purposes or hexing. It also continues the concerns of the second commandment in that someone's name was to believe intimately connected to that person's being and essence. The giving of one's name was an act of favor, trust, and in human terms, vulnerability. You know, oftentimes Jesus will ask the demon, "What is your name?" Your allegiance to your name. Part of that was his way of showing authority over them. In that ancient world, by having their name, that was seen as a way of having power over them. And Jesus was showing through something that they could understand that he did have power over them and that they were under his control. The commandment was intended to ensure that the use of Yahweh's name in oaths, vows, and treaties was taken seriously as well. So I think that if you look at the overall context, again, it's that idea of, again, in an ancient world where things are uncertain, you're trying to get control. You're using God's name to get control over other people, trying to use that name to hex them. But I also like where it can be extended. I thought this was good. The name of God is so commonly associated with empty phrases or easy religion or the latest ideology of a social or political sort, that is, using the name of God, again, in a power kind of way to advance my agenda. The name thereby gets dragged down to the level of the context in which it's used. As people hear it so used, they may have come to associate the name of God fundamentally with a cause they wish to avoid or reject. Consequently, they will not be drawn to this God, and the name will not receive its due honor and respect. At the deepest level, use of God's name is a matter of mission. That is, the Israelites really wanted to keep his name sacred and holy. And you didn't drag out the name of God just for any use, especially use to advance something that you're wanting to advance. I think there's a lot to be said for that. Again, we often will say, again, you don't want to curse and use God's name as a curse word. And I agree with that. I think that's absolutely true. But if you reduce it to the level of that, you might miss all the other ways that you're misusing it. You might, again, say, well, I didn't curse. I don't use the name as a curse. But you're dragging his name down and using it to advance your agenda, to advance your way, to gain power. Then the final of the first four commandments for us, and this will bring us to the end of our time. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And you notice this is the longest of the commandments. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. As what one person points out, Sabbath observation has no known parallel in any of the cultures of the ancient Near East. And it is distinctive in that it is independent of any of the patterns or rhythms of nature. It's not connected to the moon cycle, lunar calendar, or anything like that. It's connected to the creation story. And so, again, it stands out from all the other people as something related to this revelation of God. And I like what this person said. To keep the Sabbath day holy is to keep it separate from the other 6 days as a sanctuary of time. People are not to live as if all time were their own, to do with as they please. The God of all time retains the right to determine how one day shall or shall not be used. This weekly separation is to be publicly demonstrated by a time of rest, including the servants and animals. Remembering is more than a mental act. It is an active observation. There is no mention of it as a time for worship, but the fact that it is the Sabbath to the Lord leaves room for worship as a way of developing that commitment. And then this is from the Jewish commentary. The Sabbath is a holy Israelite innovation. There's nothing analogous to it in the entire ancient Near Eastern world. The Sabbath, in other words, is completely dissociated from the movement of celestial bodies. This is another way in which they're being taught that things are different, and that even in the creation account, when it says in the creation account that God created the lights and then he creates the moon and the sun, that was countercultural because those were gods in the ancient world. And so they were worshipped. And what that creation account is showing us is that they're not gods. That was stood out from everybody else. And the fact that the Sabbath day is not connected to any of that is another way of, again, disconnecting God from being a part of nature to being that which nature gets its being from. God is not a part of nature. He's the one in whom we live and move and have our being. So things about God are being revealed to us as human beings that come out clear in the whole of the story, but it's really amazing. And again, there are two different Protestant approaches to this. Again, that same Reformed group that that had no images oftentimes practiced what was known as Sabbatarianism. And that is, they really made it so that on Sunday you didn't do any kind of mowing of the lawn, you didn't work around the house. You just rested on that day. And that tended to be the Reformed view. And then what tended to be the Lutheran view is that this commandment is to teach us that we need to give time for God every week. And so that it's not about that. And the way this was developed is that more Lutheran view saw the Sabbath details as being related to ceremonial law, but the intention behind it, that one give time to God and recognize that all time is God, is to be lived out. So that they were not nearly as particular about making a day. And this has to do with, in many parts of the New Testament, Paul will say things like, one person treats one day as different from the other, and the other person doesn't. Let each one be convinced in their own mind. This is like Romans 13 or 14. And several places he'll say, let no one judge you as to a day, or as to a Sabbath, he'll say that. And so that more Lutheran view saw that it's not so much the particular day, it's that, as the book of Hebrews will say, you're not to forsake the assembling of yourselves together. You're to give God time, and the way you give God time is by assembling with his people and being a part of the body of Christ on a regular basis. So that they began to worship on the Lord's day because that was the day that he was raised, but nowhere in the New Testament is that a command. And so if a person worships on a Saturday night, like some churches do, that's not a violation of any kind of law. Or indeed, if say that it just so happens that Thursday is when you can be together and you meet on a regular basis as believers. And I personally go that way with the meaning of the commandments when you look at it in the light of the whole Bible, how it gets applied in the New Testament. And you can go and look at those places where Paul talks about, let no one judge you in regard to a day. But if it is important to you and it still really bothers you not to take a whole day, then you do that. Let each one be convinced in their own mind, he says. I like what one person said about the commandments. 8 of the commandments of the 10 are negatively formulated, and this is pertinent. As such, they open up life rather than close it down. That is, they focus on the outer limits of conduct rather than specific behaviors. At the same time, the negative formulation indicates that the primary concern is to protect people from behaviors that have the potential of destroying community. Yet the commands implicitly commend their positive side. And that is, they were never, what he's basically saying is, they were never meant to be limiting in the sense like the Pharisees took it. Well, I didn't murder anyone, therefore I've fulfilled the commandment. No, it meant to be, you're to reverence and honor other people's lives, and the whole of your life should express that. And it can be in all numerous kinds of ways. It's not limited to a few things. It's the way you are, the person you are, and it gets expressed in the way you are. It's not that you're not just to violate someone's family by committing adultery, You're to respect family, and you're to honor family, and all your life is about supporting and uplifting family, you know, and in all the many ways you can be doing that. It's not that you're not to be simply taking someone else's property. You're supposed to be helping, as it says in our catechism, people have their needs met, and to help them in their needs. So I like that, the way that was said there. And then finally, on the jealous God, we'll end with that. That often gives people trouble. I like this from the Jewish commentary. Jealous or impassioned, the term emphasizes that God cannot be indifferent to his creatures, that he's deeply involved in human affairs. It underscores the vigorous, intensive nature of the divine response to apostasy and to modes of worship unacceptable to him. It represents something that the author of Hebrews will say, and in the scarier parts of the book of Hebrews, where he says, our God is a consuming fire. You know, that God's nature is such that he opposes evil 100%. And I often say that to the kids in confirmation. Aren't you glad that a God who is infinite isn't even 1% open to evil? Because what's that 1% in an infinite God? That's a big, big evil. So I'm a little bit evil. No, he's 100% opposed to evil. And so this revelation of him being intensely against evil is a way of saying he's absolutely 100% opposed to evil, and his own nature expresses it in what the book of Hebrews calls a consuming fire. Our God is, and then our Paul's statement is, it's a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. That it reflects that his entire being, just like our entire beings, will have allergic reactions to certain things, and everything in our being will seek to fight it off because it sees it as destructive of us. It's a way of saying God's whole nature is against evil. So you don't want to be opposed to God. Also, visiting the guilt on the children and the children's children, the Israelite conception of itself as a community bound to God by a faithful covenant has dual implications. Society is collectively responsible for its actions, and the individual too is accountable for behaviors that affects the life of the community. That is, we can't say like Cain, "Am I my brother's keeper?" You know, Jesus said, if you lead a child astray by what you're doing, your actions, you're an example to children. I mean, and Jesus spoke in Semitic overstatement. You know, Semitic means that type of people, the Semitic people. And Semitic overstatement, they were hyperbole or extreme statement, but he said it'd be better for you to put a millstone around your neck and throw you into a lake. Well, what was he trying to say? Yes, this is really important, right? And so it's the same thing that they're saying here. Your behavior affects all the way down the rest of the community. Thus is forged a mutuality and responsibility and consequences. It is further recognized that contemporary conduct inevitably has an impact upon succeeding generations, and we all know that, you know, that every family is working out the issues of the family. And some people are going further and becoming more functional, and sometimes children will become more dysfunctional, right? And it's just, that's the way it is. None of us is an island, and so that's a way of revealing it in a very vivid way, that our behavior has long-lasting implications. But again, I like and I mentioned this already, the activity of God in redeeming Israel from bondage means that the law and the service to God and world it entails is not to be understood as another form of bondage. The law is a gift of a redeeming God. He's brought them out of Egypt. He wants to set them free. And a particular redemptive act is seen as undergirding and informing the law, not the other way around. Those who are given the law are already God's people. That's a gift of grace. Hence, the law is not understood as a means of salvation, but as instruction regarding the shape of such a redeemed life and what's to take in everyday affairs. In fact, again, the promise is good whether they obey it or not. They're going to be used by God. But the ramifications are, I can't bless you in the land if you don't live this way, because because if you don't live this way, you're acting contrary to blessing. And so it's not, the law was never meant to be a means of salvation. It was always meant to be a revelation of the way the reality is, and that if you live in tune with reality, you'll be blessed, and if you live contrary to it, there will be consequences. But God's choosing of us and saving of us is a sheer gift, just like it was for them. It's something that we receive as a gift. Well, let's end with a prayer, and we'll end it there. Father, we thank you for this wonderful revelation that you made of who you are. You came and you spoke before the people who you are, that you are the one God, that there are no other gods other than you, and that we're to let you be God. And just like there were no sacrifices in the tabernacle to manipulate you, to get you to bring about a crop, so you tell us that we're not to try to manipulate you or to try to get control over other people, but that we could rest our lives in your care because you truly care for us. You redeemed us in Jesus. And so we have that promise of entering into the ultimate rest that awaits us, the true Sabbath rest. And already we have that rest as fulfilled in Jesus, the rest of knowing that we're at peace with you and at one with you, and that he's brought about that through his finished work. And we rest right now in that forgiveness, for we receive it in Jesus' name. Amen. Again, sorry to you guys who are watching it. We'll just stick with this mic from now on.